Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BimTube Podcast. Today, I'm delighted to have Denise McKenzie with me, who I've known for several years. I'm going to say a few years, more than a few years. So welcome to you, Denise. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Stephen. It's always good to be having a good chat on a morning like this.
Great, thank you. So we made it. We had some technical issues, but you know that's IT for you, ironically. So we made it. We're here. We're going to have a chat for about 45 minutes, maybe an hour, depending how long we've got. But obviously we've talked before, and we've as in I've briefed you about the podcast. But for people joining us, this is their first one listening or watching us, then the whole point is we're not going to go into the technology side of things, but we will talk about good information and data management and these kind of issues. So Denise, if you would please introduce yourself, if you don't mind. And the other thing which you can do as well, if you don't mind, for people watching, is how did you get into the job that you do now? So take as long as you like, because it's really important that people end up in the roles that they are. So please, over to you. What do you do now and how did you get there?
What do I do now? Okay, well, so quite recently I became the managing partner of an organization called the Place Trust. The Place Trust is part of a global entity. We're a not-for-profit organization or technology and data organization, and our mission under that NGO role is really to work with governments around the world to help them map their urban landscapes. So it comes out, I guess, of now for me, a 20-year-old career working in the geospatial field, but still realizing that governments actually at heart have problems getting data. They still have trouble getting hold of the information that they need, and particularly in the developing world. So our focus as an organization is very much in the African continent, and we're just about to move into the Caribbean region as well, working with nations in that space too. But particularly, I guess, in the African continent, it's really, I guess, a look at the expansion of the urban landscapes. You know, we've got some of the fastest growing city and urban environments at the moment on the planet, and the fastest growing population on any continent going on there as well. So there's a huge range of different challenges that are happening in that space, and I guess we can get into more of that a bit later. So how did I get here? That's one of those, I mean, that's almost a podcast unto itself. I'm not techie, so definitely not going to get into the weeds with me on this. I guess, you know, you can almost say that I fell a bit into this. I was a starry-eyed politics and public policy grad out of university that joined the public service in Australia in the state of Victoria. And through that, I was in the graduate program, and where I landed was the Department of Environment. And I got in there in sort of the early 2000s, pre the era of us really having a lot of location data on mobiles, pre Google's purchase of Keyhole and the movement into having things like Google Maps, and in a spot, I guess, where geospatial was tough. You know, it was, you had really technical, spectacular specialists in this era and people trying to create digital maps, but not being able to work out yet how to make that available and accessible to the rest of the government to be able to use that. You know, you'd have kind of like this group of incredible technical specialists that would sit in a room, and someone would go and carefully knock on their door and say, "Can I please have a map?" And they'd say, "Yes, that will take me 6 to 8 weeks or something to be able to create this." And the poor, you know, person from the minister's office would be going, "But I don't have 6 to 8 weeks. We need it kind of faster than that to make the decision." And so I fell into that realm in that space, and sort of into a policy position where we were really grappling with how to make that easier. And we were trying to look at kind of mechanisms and ways to make that an easier spot. So I was lucky enough to land in a project that had me suddenly working in my early 20s with Microsoft, with a local SME working in geospatial and government, and us all trying to figure out public-private partnership for data sharing, for messing around with this web-based transfer of data business, trying to work out how to do digital cadasters and to put titles into a digital system. So for me, it was a really exciting kind of trying to fix a lot of problems era. And I stayed in that department for about 10 years, really developing a specialty in working in public-private partnership, looking at how we do data sharing. I worked a lot in the growing era of open standards around geospatial. So when OGC was really getting web services up and moving. And from there, I moved to OGC. So I actually left Melbourne, packed up my family when I had tiny little children, which is a rather insane thing to do. And I moved to the other side of the planet and moved to the UK. Worked for the OGC, which is the Open Geospatial Consortium. So it's the international standards body for geospatial standards. I was there for about 6.5 years as their head of outreach and communication. And in that, I had lots of fun. Like, I worked with the UN, I've worked with the World Bank, I've worked with the biggest defense agencies on the planet. I've worked with all the space agencies in that space as well. But I've also worked with a lot of NGOs in that through the membership as well, a lot of consultants. So it was really quite an incredible role to be able to sort of travel around the world and see all the incredible innovations that people were making with location data. So everything from health to construction to insurance to looking at planetary type spatial to looking under the ground, looking in the oceans, etc. So really in that role, I had an incredible space and time doing that. I left them about 3.5 years ago and landed as a consultant initially, sort of looking at that, what I was going to do next, wanted to stay in geospatial. And just before the pandemic hit, I ended up taking on a contract that started to look at location data ethics. And I think that, you know, if I was to characterize it time-wise, when I first joined this space, the idea of thinking about ethics was just not in people's headspace. We just hadn't used and combined data enough at that point that people were really thinking through the implications and potential harms of using data. And even location data, I think before the pandemic hit, was just, you know, no, it was a fringe topic, I think, to really think about a lot of those things. We'd seen a few things in Cambridge Analytica and what have you, but not a big amount. So I sort of started this contract, and then the pandemic hit, and we went from this kind of space where ethics around the use of location data was fringe into ethics around location data was front page of The Guardian in the UK. And we watched conversations that happened with governments trying to get Apple and Google to share location data, and these big global companies saying that's not ethical for us to give that over. You know, that's not how the terms and conditions with our users work. You know, we looked at governments trying to create tracing apps, and then questions being asked about what was going to happen with citizens' public location data at that point. So there was some really big ticket challenges. And even into the ethics of cartography. You know, if you're going to show a global dashboard of the spread of a pandemic, how do you also show that for a country like the UK, the completeness of the data is pretty good because you've got such rigorous and detailed testing programs that are collecting the data. But if you go to somewhere like Malawi, that there's no such thing as doing that. And you're only really getting the testing details perhaps a bit out of the hospital environment. So you've really got no idea of what the actual impact of the spread is. And yet you're showing a global dashboard of where the spread of the pandemic is. And so, you know, there's questions there about the cartographic, you know, integrity then of what you're showing, and how do you tell people? Because I would say that it becomes a map of data poverty. It becomes a map of showing poverty, you know, data access around the world, or, you know, inability to access good quality data. So from there, that piece of work was funded by the Emedia Network. And at the same time all of that was happening, the piece of Emedia Network that was funding us was spinning out of there to become Place. So this organization was growing just at that stage. So we're quite young, we're about 2 years. And so I joined Place in February of this year. And we're, I guess, exploring new ways of doing data sharing is probably the best way of looking at it. So we're looking at really exploring the new concept of data trusts and what that means for accessing and improving access to data globally.
Right.
At the moment.
No, it's perfect. Thank you. So you're currently at Place, and so thank you for taking obviously me through the roles as well. Just to wind back again, there'll be people listening and watching that don't have any particular data background necessarily. I know you mentioned the OGC, and you did explain what it was, but maybe just dwell on that just for a second about standards, because again, perhaps surprisingly, as part of my day job, I have to explain what data and web services are to people, and it can be challenging. So, I mean, are there any sort of highlights of of how do we explain web services? Let's do it that way.
How do you do that? How do you do web services?
How did you do that? I mean, what you know? How do you communicate to people what OGC does and what the importance of it is? Sorry to take you back there, but I'm just thinking we missed opportunity not to ask you.
You get me to I get to tell one of my favorite stories then. So this goes back to the first couple of years after I moved to the UK. And I had that dreaded moment where the teacher at school says to me, would you come in and tell the class what you do for a living? And at this stage, my daughter was 6. And I was like, I'm sorry, you want me to come into primary school and explain geospatial standards to a bunch of 6-year-olds? And she's like, yeah, that would be great. And I'm going, wow, okay.
Maps. Say the word maps. That always works. Right?
Well, I'm sitting there going, how do I do this? So I actually ended up coming up with an exercise a bit, which I have subsequently used with ministers and people in different parts of the world as well. And I did it as a keynote actually down at FOSS4G in Tanzania a few years ago as well. But it's basically, where is the chair? And essentially I walked into the classroom and I put a chair in the very center of the classroom. And then I asked the kids to all answer the question, where the chair is. And of course, we went through the exercise and they came up to about 30 kids. There was about 30 different answers. They were all right. So, you know, we got everything from the chair is in the center of the room to the chair is 2 meters from the blackboard to the chair is in classroom 1A to the chair is in Stanmore Primary School to, you know, so they were going through all those permutations of the way we describe location. And they're all right. Depending on your context and your perspective, they're all correct. But depending on how you need to locate that thing in space and time, those descriptions really matter. And so, you know, the context I then gave the kids was to say, okay, well, imagine your friend has gashed their leg out in the playground and you've put them on the chair. And you're now calling somebody who's never been to your primary school. They don't know what all of this looks like. You now have to describe for them where your friend is who's bleeding, because the ambulance has to get there to be able to help them out. How do you do that? You know, how do you do that in such a way that you can guide someone to this spot and actually understand that location? So that was one of the scenarios we did. We also then started talking about maps, and I'd had some aerial photos, pictures that I'd gotten of the school, and we got those and we sectioned them all up. And we said, okay, the school wants to build you a brand new playground. What are you going to put there? How are you going to plan that? And we took our existing photos, and then you started getting, you know, really thinking through, I guess, what you would call spatial awareness. Why would the slide need to be that close to the reception classroom versus the grade 6 classroom? Why would you want to position a kitchen garden here rather than there? You know, why would you make something this color or that color? So all of these kind of spatial questions. And at the end of the day, that's all standards. So we actually got the kids to also design their own map standard. So we went through the exercise of, okay, so if you're going to draw a map of your playground, what color should the swings be? What color should these be? What should the symbol be? What should the this be? And all of that's because if you standardize that and everyone has a common understanding, suddenly you will speed up your ability for people to understand and navigate. You'll make things more efficient. You can make things more safe at that point. So there are all those reasons for why we go through the exercise of creating standards. Now, web standards is no different to us talking in that way. The web and all of that code and those descriptions that we use is just the digital and electronic transfer of the way we talk. So it's all about how do I create a common description such that the other computer can know and understand what it is that is being said, so that everyone knows what's there. So that's my explanation of why we do standards.
And it's a very good one. So thank you. I might have to borrow the where is the chair scenario, but maybe with a different object. But I like it because the other maybe obvious thing for you is the scenarios. I often work with people that don't give scenario, you know, they don't give situations. And that's where they lose people. They just go, oh, because
Because you should do it.
Yeah, well, that's probably the wrong answer. Yeah, give me a scenario, give me a use case or whatever. So no, very good. So thank you very much, OGC. And of course, there's a few. I mean, there's lots of things we can talk about. The other thing I noted down. So forgive me because I'm jumping all over the place, but I'll forget to ask you. So obviously, I'll put links to anything we discuss. I'll provide links so people can look up the OGC if they're now they are familiar with it, but they can go and learn more about that. The other thing I put was the Locust Charter. Now,
yeah,
did you want to say something about that and where people can find more information?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you jump on Google and you type in Locust Charter these days, thankfully you'll go and find the charter. So the Locust Charter came out of that data ethics work that I did during the pandemic, and that was through an initiative called the Benchmark Initiative at Geovation, which Geovation is the innovation arm of the Ordnance Survey here in the UK. So Locust Charter was the result of a series of global workshops that we did in collaboration actually with Ethical Geo, which is part of the American Geographical Society at the same time. The group of workshops was really an exercise in trying to just unearth what we meant by being responsible with location data or being ethical with location data. So we sort of traipse around in webinars and digital workshops for about 6 months, really kind of exploring what the values of practitioners were, what the principles were around good use, all of these sorts of things. We looked at a lot of other pieces of work like the Signal Code, which came out of Harvard, which was very much about safe use of Earth observations in humanitarian situations. We looked at work that had come out of, I guess, the human rights space, and looking at things like the Human Rights Charter and what that meant in a digital context as well. And what shook out at the end was first learning, which always makes me smile, is that we probably spoke to close to 1,000 practitioners working in the field of location data in various spaces. And I can categorically say that 99.9% of those really just want to use the data for good. They really want to use it and they see so much value for what that sort of data can do in the world. But they also consistently said to us, but I don't always know what good looks like. And I don't know what I don't know, and I don't know what the potential harms always are of what we might be doing as well. So I need something that's going to help me sort of think about that or to explore that more in the work that I'm doing. That's how we got Locust Charter. So Locust Charter is the result of all of those workshops and all of that learning. And it's 10 principles around the ethical and responsible use of location data. So they cover things like, obviously, privacy's in there. It talks about bias. It talks about harms. For me, really important things it talks about is things like the protection of vulnerable. And we talk not just about vulnerable communities, but the potential of vulnerable environments as well. So, close to my heart back in Australia is things like the, Indigenous sites. And the fact that you need to know where Indigenous sites are, but perhaps you don't always publish that publicly because of the potential that might have to put that in danger. So there is some real challenge and nexus when you talk about ethical use of data. When you talk about open data, not everything should be open. Some very good reasons why some data should never be made open. And I think there's some really good evolved thinking around that at the moment, particularly in the UN Foundation's discussions around digital public goods and digital public infrastructure and what we mean by those things. But I think also probably one of my favorite out of the 10 principles, if I had to pick one, is actually the very first one. And it's much more positive in saying that we have an ethical obligation to realize the opportunities of the data that we have access to and that we can gather. So we have a responsibility, I believe, as technical practitioners and as specialists in our field to make sure that we do have the best quality data, that we do have the best access to the information that we need to help make evidence-based decisions in the world. And that, to me, is a really important ethical principle. It's not just about prevention of harm. It's not just about, that's really important, but it's not the only thing. We actually equally have to think about making sure that we've got the right avenues to get the right information in the right ways. And that's, for me, a really important part of the principle. So I'd love, they're founding principles. We love people's feedback on that. They've been out in the wild now for about 18 months. So lots of different use. We've got governments using them. We've had private sector using them in a whole raft of different ways. So always love the feedback. I had someone come up to me in a conference in Sat Summit recently who said they've actually integrated into their geospatial course at university, and it's now part of the things that they teach around using things ethically. And I was like, wow.
So that's really good. I'm just thinking of layers now. You know, we're talking about the OGC is, I know it's more than interoperability, but it is it's a core part of it. And then we're talking about now. So now we can share data thanks to the OGC. The challenge is now, what do we do with it, or how do we use it? How do we share it? And again, I'm just pointing this out for people listening or watching, but I see layers as well. I've always seen it like that. You know, certainly the first half of my career was just finding data. So yeah, ethics, quite as you said, probably didn't come into it. I was just begging people for data.
I think people still do that.
It's sad, isn't it? And then and then when you get it, I think just to reflect on the open data side as well, something you said there about certainly I remember when the UK government, there was sort of an open data initiative, again for people listening or watching, I know you know. And I remember thinking, it was quite easy for me to geocode or show for people without a GIS background. And I spoke with people in the cartography and the mapping field who wouldn't have them technical expertise because they'd come in, they use different types of software. They use more illustration software. And I remember thinking there is a skills gap, you know, and that was just on that was just on a professional level. I think, that there's something more to just sharing the data. You have to enable people. I don't know if you've got anything to add. I know with the ethics side of it we've already talked about, but about enabling, like maybe even on a technical level, which I don't want to go too technical, but how do we help enable people use the data? Have you got any thoughts on that? Maybe initiatives OGC or more currently?
I think it's somewhat layers again in what you think about with this as well. If I think, way back, and these are one of those moments where my kids laugh and it's like, Mum, you're talking about the olden days again. And I'm like, yes, I'm talking about the olden days again. It's like when I was younger. But if I think back to kind of my teens, and us playing with computers at that point, when we were doing that, those of us playing with computers typically, put wires together, often stuck them together with electrical tape to make sure that things stayed together. We wanted our LAN parties to work. And would code a bit and would do, but we could be essentially all encompassing. We did all of it at that point because there wasn't the complexity of the software systems that we've got and the digital ecosystems that we've got now. I think now that one person that was back in the kind of 1980s, 90s kind of era, that's 20 people now in terms of different jobs and specialties. So it's broken up now, and you've got people who are data specialists, but then you've got analysts who are not interested in the technical use of the data or the clean of the data at that point. They just want access to data in a particular way, in a particular format. And I may argue that perhaps at that point, things are not pure data any longer, but they're information, or they're, you may be sort of switching. And I think there is a real difference in layer. And I think sometimes we confuse ourselves by using this word data a little too, perhaps a little too nebulous a fashion. Because I think, and people say, oh, some people are not data literate. And I'm like, no, I think they're information literate in their field and their space. So what they need is the data expert to have been able to source the data, clean it. Let's be serious. Hardly any you ever get a piece of data that you don't have to do some sort of processing to get it into a shape. Sorry anybody that thinks that that's otherwise, but the world of data is never straightforward. And I think that those users are sort of a different breed of information user, I think, at that point. And I think that perhaps we confuse between the two a little bit, between kind of a data specialist and what ultimately is, I think, an information or an analysis user at the other end of that. So I think thinking through, I'm hearing better conversations with people around thinking through the, I guess, the life cycle of a service and the data and the multiple types of data perhaps that need to feed and move in and out of that service over the course of time, and the different user points that you have in that service kind of space. If that helps. I mean, I think I'm trying to say is it is really complicated now, but I think we expect end users perhaps to have more data literacy than perhaps they should. And I think perhaps we could be better at thinking about that sort of service life cycle a bit better and sort of where we fit.
So just for the record, I completely agree with you, where I will have nodded at other people I've spoken to on this podcast, and where they say data information is the same. I agree with you. It's not the same, because data is data, databases, like you talked about interoperability at a data level. And of course, there's that classic Gartner, sort of data information, sort of what is it? Insights, knowledge, all the, anyway. So again, I won't wheel that out too much, but I think it is true with a lot of people now. I talk about either dashboards or reports, ideally it's a dashboard, but that's a different conversation, isn't it? If we're both working at sort of direct level, C-level, whatever, or senior, whoever it is, we're not probably talking about data. Well, maybe we are. If it's a CDO, we probably are, but we're probably talking about outputs, outcomes, dashboards.
Yes.
And that's a completely different thing. Sorry, go ahead.
And ultimately impact, I think. One of the things that I've really noticed is a language shift myself in recent times. Is I think we went through the sort of last 10 years or so, perhaps, talking a lot about being user-centric in our design with all of our technology systems. More recently, though, it's one step further from that. And it's like, no, how do we actually start thinking about being impact-centric? So it's past that user of the service into what does that user do with the information and the insight that they've got? What's the impact at the other end of having all this information and all this data? And I think, particularly when you start looking at things like, say, the climate change data services and things that are around, where we're sensational at collecting data about what the problem is. Absolutely brilliant at that. Everybody can tell you how bad the state of the world is in on so many different levels. But what I'm not seeing is really good dashboards, really good metrics about how knowing that has ultimately changed something on the ground. How having that analysis of what the problem and the challenge is actually helping us then positively impact and make better decisions where we're in the ground. I think that's kind of like, to me, the next holy grail that we've got to chase from our space of working with data.
I think the first person I interviewed on these podcasts just happened to be the head of sustainability at Gatwick Airport in London, who I'm friends with. But so of course that was we talked about these outcomes, but perhaps surprisingly they have come up on a lot of them. Sort of outcomes, benefits. So maybe people have got a different take on it, but so you'll be close to things like the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, others won't be, but I think it's happening, the alignment. But I think, have you got anything to add just for people that probably understand what we mean by outcomes, measuring these things? But how do you go about how would you get it in a business? Let's pretend I'm a middle manager, I'm either GIS or some data information manager. How do I go to the board and say, where do I start to look at measuring impact or benefit? I know it's a massive topic, but where would you start if you went in an organization cold and said, here's the things I'd focus on? I know it depends on the organization, but just generally, what kind of themes might to promote that area? Because data doesn't float the boat of a lot of people at board level. So where should people go? What should they talk about?
Well, so funnily enough, actually, I ended up talking about this a little bit when we were in New York at the UN GGIM meetings this year. So that's the United Nations Global Geospatial Information Management Committee, for those that love a good acronym. Essentially, in short terms, what that is the annual meeting of all the national mapping authorities from around the world, from the different governments that come together to look at the mapping issues of the world. Also, usually statistics agencies and the hydrographic organizations are usually involved there as well. But at the moment, they're in a phase of really looking at how they implement better geospatial information infrastructure, and they've got a whole framework that's now been developed as part of that committee. And a lot of that is on the back of the SDGs and looking at how you make impact and change with those in that space. And we had a whole panel that was all about how do you sustainably, I love this phrase, sustainably finance the IGIF, which is this framework that they're working towards. And when I read the concept note initially, it was all basically tell us how to attract donor funding to our countries to get this done. And I said, well, there's nothing much sustainable about that for starters. But the question came around to me, you know, if you're going to create an investment plan, you know, or you want to put in an investment request into your Treasury Department, you know, what do you say? What do you do that? And the things that I kind of said in that is there's really, you need to look at any organization, this goes government, business, etc. At the end of the day, what is the mission of that organization? What is it trying to do? You know, is ultimately it trying to build better buildings? Is it trying to improve the health and well-being of a particular community area? You know, what is it trying to do? And that's where you start, because that's your metric. You know, what you need to look then at is the data that you're going to need to work out what positive impact is for that group. And that sometimes that's talking to them about it, because I think also sometimes organizations can end up so many layers and so many far bits removed from those that they think they know what's good for that group, or they think that they know what's good for that stakeholders that don't always know what that is. So I think there is very much an element of, and I think it's thinking about them as stakeholders more than users. Techies, I think in our technical world, in our data world, we tend to think very much about users. And I think when we think about users, we often stop short of actually getting to the stakeholders, because the users of our systems and services are often the ones that are at the coalface making a decision or putting a service actually out there. And we go, okay, but we stop with the user. We don't go as far as then collecting the information and the data about the stakeholder and the impact of what the user is doing with the stakeholder at that stage. So I think for me, looking at that, it's very much about always understanding what the mission of an organization, what the objectives are, you know, and that's for any government. You know, if a government's looking at reducing carbon, if a government's looking at improving efficiencies around transport, you know, if a business is about selling more stuff, you know, in particular areas, it's understanding, well, who those stakeholders are and making sure that when you do that point of sale, that you're collecting that piece of data at the same time and designing it in that way. That's where the data is valuable, because then you're actually going to know whether what you're doing is working or not.
Your point about users, it reminds me of it's all process-led. I know either you've said that directly or implied it, but again, just for people listening or watching, it's sort of, I get a little bit obsessed about the process, you know, and I'll say there are process improvement professionals. This is a thing. This is you know, so, and you're talking about alignment. Has, out of interest, and not putting you on the spot here, because it may or may not have done, but there's so ISO 9001, you'll know, ISO 55000, did that come up? What you were sort of saying, your point that you made, aligns very closely with, there's an international standard in strategic asset physical, well, it could be any assets, but let's just say physical asset management, called ISO 55000, and that talks about alignment or line of sight, and it talks about outcomes, you know, basically when. But the parallel, we're talking about data. In the case of that standard, it's typically how do we use our physical infrastructure. But for me, it's conceptually the same. You know, we've got assets, which happen to be digital assets, but also they're linked with infrastructure. But anyway, do people talk about asset management in that way, like physical asset management or infrastructure or?
I think the reality is, yes, within the communities that look at that sort of area. And I think that that's probably something that I've definitely seen change over the last 20 odd years, is I think back when I fell into that world of geospatial, it was very easy to be a general geospatial professional, you know, and you did a GIS course and you learned how to make maps and do cartography and all of these principles that kind of go with geography at that point. I think what you're hitting on now is the sort of evolution that the sort of profession is really going through now. And I think it's the same way that once upon a time, probably medicine did something similar. You know, I think medicine probably started as a quite general practice, but then as it got more complex and it got more detailed and there was a greater maturity in it as a profession, it had to start specializing, because the reality is no one person could hold it all in their heads or be, you know, particular in those particular areas. And I think, if I'm honest, looking at it now as a profession, I think that's where we're hitting. And I think that what we're now seeing is the need to, you know, yes, there are some fundamental geographic principles around mapping that are the same, that everyone needs to kind of learn, in the same way that I'm sure when people start medicine, they all learn basics about the human body and all those things that they have to do. But then there's kind of a point, I think, where you have to start going, well, yeah, but am I more interested in mapping oceans, or am I more interested in mapping buildings, or am I more interested in mapping these areas? And I think that we have to get more specialist in those, and you kind of have to stick to that a bit at that point as your professional space, because otherwise you won't develop that depth. And that's, I think, where you get the exciting understanding from a technical professional at that point of like, well, I do know more about what happens with the impact of this, and I'm going to learn more about the impact of the type of mapping that I'm going to do, and I'll be able to provide better advice to those customers that I'm talking about that are going to be my users about what those users are going to do at the other end of this. And I think that, so to go to your point about the standard, I think, yes, absolutely, in the asset world, that's definitely things that come up. Do I think that it's bled across those lines into the different domains in the same way? Nope. I think that they're very much kind of like, you've got some language barriers and terminology barriers that sort of go between the different domain streams, I think, in geospatial now.
Yeah, I think it's like BIM as well, just for the sake, again, for people, the BIM in this podcast is better information management. I should spell it out, not BIM. However, in the international standards ISO 19650, they talk about alignment. And again, that's maybe a niche or a specialism, but effectively it's information management, isn't it? But again, for an audience that wants to talk that language, that understands that topic, and traditionally they're probably not the people talking about the outcomes, the things that you were talking about. I think that's another take on it. I mean, just because we don't have too long, I mean, part of this podcast is also clearly to find people to where they can find more resources and pick up different themes. But although I don't want to focus on technology, however, it can be exciting. I mean, are there any innovative uses of technology just at a high level? Say, oh yeah, this is interesting. So it could be UAVs, sort of drones, or anything like that you say, oh, that's noteworthy. We don't need to talk about the detail, but you say, oh, this is emergent things, or it could be AI, artificial intelligence, anything sort of interesting that I won't be aware of.
I would say both those things are interesting at the moment, actually. And I probably, we're sort of in that space, place and places, community of users definitely falls into the category of using those. So we are an organization that definitely is utilizing drones in what we're doing in different parts of the world. So that ability now to utilize something like a drone in, say, a highly built up slum area to capture, detailed resolution of sort of down to 5 centimeter accuracy in these places gives you an understanding of a landscape that we just haven't been able to access as easily beforehand. So I think there's some really interesting things in that. It's definitely got some, we're in that nexus, I think, with that one, where the technology is developing far too quickly for the regulatory environments to keep up with. And we've definitely got some challenge, I think, with how we use that as a tech. And it's got a whole raft of implications here with, drones with noise levels in urban spaces and congestion of things flying around. You hear the wonderful descriptions like Amazon movements of drones, dropping things in parcels. And actually in my head, I suddenly imagine this buzzing cloud of, machines flying around my airspace. And I'm like, no, that sounds awful. I can, as much as I love that tech, I can still remember being in Assisi in Italy at one stage, up in this beautiful castle space, super quiet above the clouds, and someone put their drone up. And we spent the next 45 minutes listening to this irritating buzz of this machine in this, perfectly quiet landscape. And you were just like, if I had a slingshot right now, I'd love to just like knock you out the sky kind of thing. Yeah. So I think, there's definitely some conversation to be had about, appropriateness, etc., with that use of tech. But I think just our ability to use that tech to gather data in ways that we hadn't done before is really exciting, and I mean, I'm excited looking at the amount of the sort of cities that we're talking to across the African continent at the moment that will then result in better access to up-to-date information about what's going on in the world. That, to me, is a tech that's super exciting. So to layer on top of that, the AI is ridiculously exciting. We had probably one of my favorite examples of a research organization that used our data was they were able to use their machine learning to feature detect and find all the air conditioning units in a particular area of the city, and not just find them, but because of the resolution of the data, work out the size of those air conditioning units, and then make an estimation of the energy draw of each one of those as well. So from that, they were then able to model and be able to say, well, okay, if you had a temperature fluctuation of X, you're probably going to increase your electricity draw by, you know, Y. And then this is going to, we can then look at the energy grid and work out where the hot spots are going to be because of the number of air conditioning units and where the weak spots are going to be. So you talk about that asset management and thinking about an electricity grid for a city as a piece of asset you have to manage. That information suddenly gives you a hugely different understanding, if you like. But equally, you then know what types of air conditioning units. You know, can you make a program where you might help change over those units, or look at how there's improvement to building types in that changes the energy infrastructure. So I think the exciting thing, and that's without anybody getting on the ground. That's not people walking around having to do site visits and look and gather the information about the unit. That's within half an hour's worth of running an AI over it, you've got a much better picture about a particular area. So I think, to me, the exciting thing about that is just the insights we can start getting from all of that information, and what sort of changes ultimately that makes in our ability to make decisions. To me, that's super exciting. But I will say we still have the data sharing challenge and the data access challenges, and I don't think they've disappeared.
So thank you for them examples. They do sound very exciting. And I was just thinking it's so we talked about data sharing. I mean, I don't know what your take is, but my personal thoughts are now the challenge is sharing the case studies or the examples, the use cases. Again, we're talking about layers, because I'll often say slightly flippantly to get people to think, to clients, to say, if we had infinite budget for technology and data, which we don't, but pretend we do, then what are you going to do with it, right? So interoperability disappears. We've got infinite budget for survey, but survey everything now. And what it comes down to is their imagination or the use cases. I don't. How do we do that? Because the example you gave about air conditioning, you know, would that be public, or not that specific one? But how do we share these case studies, these use cases, these scenarios? Because that's the challenge. I mean, that takes different domain expertise to do that, including engineers and maybe the manufacturer of the air conditioning system to give dimensions. Have you got any thoughts on that, or maybe that's a missing piece? Sharing knowledge. This is knowledge management.
Do you know? I think I'm seeing some of what I'd hoped would happen in this space. In that, you know, I went through years worth of sitting in conferences, listening to wonderful geo and mapping people going, why aren't these organizations in our conference? Why haven't we got all of these people coming here to us? And I remember turning around and going, why are you in here if you want to talk to them? Why aren't you out at their conference, you know, talking, you know, at the insurance conference? Why aren't you out talking at the construction conference kind of thing? And I think that that's happening now. So perhaps we're not seeing it in our traditional, maybe geospaces in the same way. But I think what I'm seeing is increasingly companies that once upon a time would have called themselves a generalist geospatial or mapping company are actually now becoming like a specialist climate and sustainability, or supply chain mapping organization, or an aviation mapping organization, or an oceanography mapping organization. And I think that what we're seeing is actually that they're beginning to specialize in one or two areas. And then actually what they're doing is they're off attending different conferences. So they've got the use cases, they know how this works, and they're actually out talking in those different domain areas in that way. I think that's probably the way it's going to happen, rather than perhaps a lovely, nice little bag of things that we can all look at from a geospatial perspective. Certainly from a place perspective, we're looking, because there will be a lot of different use cases of how you use the data that we help collect. So we intend to publish all of that. One of the big mission points of Place is to publish as openly as we possibly can. We talk about being as open as we can be and as closed as we need to be, depending on the data.
I think that contrast between vertical and horizontal, and I know we do that. So again, I was just putting it out there for other people to think about. Is the, you know, things like geo business, which maybe I'll share a link with. It's obviously horizontal as well, but I'll often go to water events and finance events, insurance events, and you know, blah, blah, blah. I was at London Build last week. It's construction, obviously, and I think that's a challenge. It takes time, and you have to be a certain grade just to say, I'll go to all these different events. I still think, you know, that there is a place for sharing domain expertise, but yeah, I agree. I'm sure I see companies at different events that I would not have done several years ago. So I absolutely agree with you. We don't have too long left, so I mean, maybe we should just briefly mention again the AGI. Maybe again, remember this isn't specifically for geospatial people. Obviously, we've stuck to that theme because that's our backgrounds, but. So maybe just an overview to the AGI and what they do. Again, there'll be people listening to this that don't do geospatial at all. Yeah,
I'm going to say, I think I may have even forgotten to add AGI and sharing
that's
that.
Okay. Well, we can now. No problem. Go ahead.
So obviously AGI is actually how I know Stephen. So it's the Professional Association for Geospatial People, or people essentially who work with location data here in the UK. So very much focuses on being a organization that helps connect and is a platform for sharing basically anything to do with location. So it is the generalist space. It works closely with organizations like the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. It works closely with the Royal Geographical Society. And, you know, really I think is about trying to recognize that this is a space where there are a lot of connections to be made. So it is the spot where we try and nut out a lot of those use cases. It is the place where we kind of say, well, what's the new elements of location and how is that affecting the professionals that we've got within the UK space there as well. So it's a membership organization. There is a very light free tier that people can join. So if you're listening to this and you're interested in knowing more, it's quite easy to get in on the website and just at least join up and sort of have a look and see what's there. It has an annual conference that covers the whole UK, usually in London once a year. And we've just had that in November, and that was great fun. Lots of very much a sustainability and climate focus to what we looked at there. But you'll also find ones in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland as well across the course of the year too. And just very much about, I guess, bringing together like-minded people trying to nut out a lot of these problems that we've been talking about today, really.
Right. Thank you. And again, I'll put a link to that. So Association for Geographic Information and I'll link to that. So yeah, that is how we know each other. And I think there is something sort of instinctive as well for people who don't have a background in data information management, where you see maps. I mean, again, it is just meaningful. The visualization, you think, wow, this, I mean, I guess I feel lucky that that's my background sometimes, because that can be the hook, can't it? Say, visualize data.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm sure you've heard me moan about a little bit at times is I think perhaps we shot ourselves a little in the foot when we started using the word geospatial and we stopped using the word geography. And I think if you know, human beings have been frankly using geography as long, you know, back into caveman days. We found maps that are 40,000 years old of people describing where things are. So humans naturally geographically contextualize everything. You know, you listen to an accent, you're immediately trying to work out what country someone's from. You look at what someone looks like, you're like, where might they be coming from? You know, often you'll go to a conference, the first thing you ask someone is, how far did you travel that day? Or where did you travel from? So we always think geographically in what we're doing. But for some reason, when we switched into making digital maps, we decided to create this whole new vocabulary, if you like, around these digital maps. And we stopped using a lot of our geographic terms. And I think for a lot of people, that has probably where we've ended up with a bit of confusion for people about what it is that we're trying to do. So you'll often hear me switch back into use of geography and maps and places and location and what have you. And I tend to drop a lot of the techie terms.
Yep, I'm completely with you. Hence the audience for this. I think there has been a lot of jargon, not only in pure IT, which has got a problem on its own, and then we mix government, central government into the mix. We've got more acronyms. Then we've got some niche subset of geography / IT, which is GIS and geospatial. It's a heady mix for confusion, isn't it? And now we've got just if I can't think of any more acronyms, that just quickly and briefly, I've literally probably only got about 5 more minutes of your time. Digital twins, right? I'll just throw it in there while we're on a roll.
I was going to say any second you're going to say metaverse, and then
no, I won't today. Don't worry. We got AI is close enough. I know it's not the same, but so digital, without us having to define it or whatever, because that's happened on other podcasts. What is that something that people talk about that you work with, or is it not quite there yet? Or I mean, it's literally just a brief question. I'm just interested. Yeah. Does that term pop up? I'm not saying it should or shouldn't. I'm just saying
it does. I think it's probably, if I'm being really honest, I think it's a very first world phrasing and thing to look at. I think there are a couple of countries that have really kind of, taken it to heart, pull it apart, and really conceptualize what that means to use something that's basically a 3D model. And, I always hesitate when I hear people say it's the digital representation of the world. I'm like, it's a digital representation of the world. In the same way that you're going to draw a map of say we're both given the same place and we never looked at each other's maps, we're both probably going to draw them slightly differently. They will have totally similar comparable features to them that will identify them as the place, but we'll pick slightly different, line thicknesses or colors or symbols, etc., with how we ultimately draw that picture. Digital twins are the same in that respect. It's not, it's another geographic representation of what physically exists. So they're not to say they're not valuable. They're absolutely valuable. They're brilliant for helping people potentially conceptualize things that may change and how you might manage something. So asset management, etc. They're great. But I can tell you, if you go into some of these cities in the developing world and you talk to their city councils about digital twins, they're like, man, I don't even have a a digital title system. What are you talking about? Like creating a digital twin of my space. People build bits to this city, every hour. How on earth are you going to capture that in a digital twin? And so I think there is, to me, I guess, in the work that we do and a lot of things that we look at as well, there's some very fundamental issues we've got around accessing correct data that we need to still solve before I think we can really say, let's do a big investment and start using digital twins. It's not me saying that they're not valuable, but I do think that context and where you're talking about makes a big difference.
No, I agree with you. Again, it's stages, it's phased, it's layered again, or whatever the appropriate word is. But that comes up a lot, So I just thought I'd mention it again, but because everyone's in a different place, aren't they? Whether it's a nation, a region, a organization, a group within an organization, it's sort of a repeating pattern. And certainly communication. I mean, given your past roles, obviously we've not actually talked about communication because that's what you do. But again, that's often a point I will make. But you've made that point quite clearly with your example of where is the chair. It's a lot of people coming into this with a more technical background maybe sometimes, be careful what I say, might need assistance with communication. Of course, that's been what you've been focused on, in various ways. And I think that's, I mean, have you got any observation on that people need help? Look for communication professionals, I think. Often.
Yeah, that's probably the best piece of advice. You've nicked exactly what I would say to let people. Don't undervalue the importance of the communication professionals when you're a technical organization. I think they're really, really, really key. Definitely don't undervalue how valuable a really good business analyst in your organization can be. Like if I was going to pick a critical role in any technical organization, I'd say any org that doesn't hire a really great BA is mad, because you can create the most spectacular piece of software, best thing on the planet that can do amazing things. If you cannot communicate that out, the value and what it can do to others, it's completely useless. Everything you've built is not valuable at that point. So tools are only as good as their use. and what they ultimately do. And I think it's really important then that we sort of think about how that. So what I would also say to organizations is give your technical people a break. Don't expect them to be communications professionals. Let them be fantastic technical people and get communications professionals that can take that greatness of the technical world and take it out and turn it into what the communications be. And don't be offended when they really simplify it.
So I mean, that's a perfect place to leave it, because I think exactly. I mean, that's it. We can't be good at everything. I mean, just while we wrap up, so thank you so much, first of all, for your time and your insights. And I know there's 100 other things we could talk about, but again, it's about wayfinding. Where can people find more information? Any of the sites or links or organizations you've mentioned, I'll go through and put a link in. But just for the last couple of minutes, are there any other places you can either remind people, or are there other resources, either online or otherwise, that you think you would recommend people to go to? So maybe something you've not mentioned, or you could remind people.
Yeah, I think look, I think particularly for non-technical people, there's some really interesting global dialogue going on at the moment that I think for me is the real evolution of the open data movement. We've had an open data movement for a really long period of time. It's done some great, wonderful things. But the terms I would go looking for in the next little while that I think are going to start having some big impact in global data dialogue is around this concept of a digital public good and digital public infrastructures, and also data trusts. Because I think these sort of three terms and this way of thinking is really about trying to say that we've still got problems with data accessing up to, getting up to date data. And so we're amazing at talking about the shiny, sparkly, amazing next tool thing of an art of possible, but often they're useless unless you've got the data to put in them. And we're not focusing on fixing, I think, that data input side that we need to be putting into those tools to really realize things. So you'll see some stuff coming out of the UN Foundation that's around this in the next couple of months. But I think particularly for the realm of the sort of mapping geospatial people, this idea of thinking about things as a digital public infrastructure, to me, is kind of an evolution again of that realm of spatial data infrastructures and thinking about those data infrastructures. But I think we're moving a bit from just a purest technical way of thinking about it into thinking more about the purpose of these infrastructures and the impact of these infrastructures and what they have to do. And I think that, to me, is quite exciting, because I think it shifts us into a different realm of thinking about data.
Great. Thank you, Denise. That's, again, perfect way to end it. So thank you so much for your time, Denise McKenzie. I appreciate it. And again, any links that you've mentioned, I'll put it in the bottom there. So again, thank you for your time, and I'll see you, I hope, soon.
No worries. Thanks, Stephen.